Excellent. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the last talk of the day. And it gives me great pleasure to present to you Mr. Brian Swann, who is going to be talking to us about DNA and Welsh family history. Now, Brian obtained a PhD in organic chemistry in 1971 from the University of East Anglia, and then worked in and around the pharmaceutical industry until his retirement in 2011. He first became involved in family history in 1967 and in the use of DNA in family history in 2000. From 2007, he has been regional coordinator for the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, whose stand is just over here on the left-hand side. It's free to join, so please do sign up. And he helped introduce the DNA area into Who Do You Think You Are? So this actual area is Brian's brainchild. He still enjoys research using paper documentation as well as trying to understand and explain the latest advances in the DNA field, and we're going to hear some of that in his talk on DNA and Welsh family history. So can I ask you to give a big warm welcome to Mr. Brian Swann.
Okay, you hear me all? Lovely. Last one of the day, here we go. Thanks, Morris. As I said, I've been around a fair amount of time these days in doing all of this, and there's a whole lot of people in the DNA field, in some ways, that know far more than I am. As I get older, I become more aware of my limitations and all these sort of things and how much I have to learn. So what I'm really going to share with you is my experiences of working through DNA. We have some very sophisticated people these days who use some really refined techniques. And some of us have just come from a talk on that up in the main area upstairs with the group at Oxford. But this is really sort of my learning experience of working with DNA in relation to Wales. That's really how I became interested in DNA. It's part of how I got interested in family history. As you'll discover, I have a fairly unusual surname from Wales, which is what piqued me, happens to be my middle name. But Wales tends to be a little bit misunderstood. It has a unique family history compared to other bits of the British Isles. And we perhaps are getting to a position where we can exploit DNA to get at some of that, which hasn't been quite the way in the past. So the first thing I'm going to say is no such thing as Welsh DNA. You learn with doing DNA. There's no such thing relating to the geographical boundaries that we grow up and do this. But again, DNA or DNA program is all about combining DNA and documentation. So Welsh family history is unique, and combining DNA documentation is what this is all about. That's what you learn as you work your way through this. It's not going to give you a panacea. DNA is just an aid to help you sort through family history, although it can get back deeper in terms of ancestry than you can get with paper documentation. And we'll talk about some of the paper documentation in Wales as what else do we get. So this is really what lessons have we, stroke I, learned in doing this through these years. And I'm sorry, I have to run through some basics. This is actually teaching some people here how to suck eggs, but equally there's other people that have wandered in off the street, if I put it that way, and so I'm back at square one. Just to remind people, you have 22 chromosomes that are called autosomes, 2 sex chromosomes, X and Y, Y chromosome unique to men. And we've had lots of people in all the other talks talking about what you can do with all the DNA across these things today, and starting to do work across the X chromosomes. I'm actually going to focus all of my energy, almost all of my energy, on the Y chromosome. That's where I spend most of my time and most of my interests. And just to remind you, DNA, 4 bases, curls up into the helix that we're well aware of. But then, of course, the helix gets supercoiled into these things that we call chromosomes that we saw there. 4 bases, double helix, 22 chromosomes, X and Y, supercoiled around these special proteins called histones. So we tend to be very familiar with this picture here in the double helix, but in fact it's all this supercoiling, etc., that goes on that enables you to pack all the stuff within inside the cell. And I always like this picture. This is the X chromosome for women. This is the Y chromosome for men. As you can see, it's pretty poor, pretty small in terms of size, and pretty vestigial. And just to give you an overview, because I stand on the ISOG stand there talking to all of you customers that come through, and I as you can imagine, get all sorts of things from all sorts of level on DNA. So this again is just really basic. But you need to remember that when you talk about DNA these days, there are different sorts of DNA that you can talk about. So on the Y chromosome, we're talking about STR testing, SNP testing, and that's what I'll tend to concentrate. Mitochondrial DNA, in mitochondria, this is what they've used for looking at Richard III, a very small genome, specific, female to female. Autosomal DNA testing, in some ways a lot more complicated. You're talking across all those autosomes, chromosomes, main ones that are there, ways to compare, cousins back 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. Difficult to get beyond that, given the scrambling that occurs in the autosomal chromosomes. There's just starting to have work on the X chromosome in there. It has a slightly different inheritance pattern to the one that's above here. And again, an awful lot of interest in an ancient DNA. And the one thing I'm going to say about ancient DNA is that it's always going to be expensive to do, so it ain't going to be something that you're going to be able to afford to go over there and get ancient DNA done, no matter where you get it from. A lot of interest scientifically in it, a lot of interest getting picked up in the media to do this. You just need to remember it's always at the moment going to be expensive to do, relatively speaking. Whoever works on it needs to get significant sums of money to work on the samples that are there. They're very important in relation to human evolution, Richard III, these sorts of samples. In terms of history, it's important. But you just need to remember that there's these 6 different forms of DNA. So when I get people talking to me about DNA, the first thing we spend our time doing is figuring out what they're talking about. This is just to remind you, the Y chromosome goes down this line, the X chromosome goes down this line with the red dots. So the Y chromosome is unique to men, the X chromosome is unique to women. The autosomal chromosomes go across the bit in the middle in terms of inheritance. So if you're back here at the, whatever it is, great-grandparent level, you're talking about 12.5% of your DNA getting down to you at the bottom. And I'm not going to focus on it, but the X chromosome that's in here, the inheritance pattern is more complicated, and if you follow these lines down, you can sort out what that is. Okay. And I call this, my jargonese words, anyone who works here is familiar with this, but if you do anything on DNA, you've got to get familiar with SNPs and STRs. SNPs are single base changes that happen in your DNA, so you've got a thymine here changing to cytosine. And STRs, short tandem repeats, short bunches of DNA, and this can repeat, and N can vary from 5 up to 30 or plus. And essentially it's these repeats are what we use when we're looking at normal family history. So these Y SNPs, single base changes on the chromosome, they define branches of the human family tree known as haplogroups or clades. They're essentially irreversible mutations. If you go over and look at the ISOG standard over there, we've got a nice map on that from about 2010 on the wall. If I put it on the screen, you wouldn't be able to see it. And that is changing realistically at not quite the speed of light, but it's getting really complicated. There's a lot of action in, and you'll never end up with a chart again that will be able to fit on a wall. It's moving that fast. There's an awful lot of effort going into that. And certainly a concept that's really useful to remember, this is what I use when I have people standing opposite me in the stand. The Y SNPs define the major branches of the tree. That's the tree that we're all in, down to the twigs, if you like, and the STRs define the leaves on the end of the twigs. So if you're interested in doing what I call conventional family history, you're looking at the STRs at the moment down on the leaves. That may change, but that's really where we are at the moment. The testing companies use these STR patterns to get at your haplogroup assignment. They have tested enough samples that they can use these STR patterns to assign you into the main haplogroups. If for any reason that's ambiguous, they will actually test to get you into the main SNP group using single nucleotide testing. And the important thing to remember in all this is that Y SNPs overruled Y STRs in terms of matches. You must have the same SNPs for the STRs to match. So you can get people occasionally that seem to have the same profile of the number of STR markers, particularly if you only measure at low numbers. The lowest number test you can use is 12 markers, and you get an awful lot of matches in that sort of scenario. And one of the ways to distinguish between those matches it's looking at the the SNP markers, the SNP markers, to help give you more discrimination. And that's just my visual aid of looking at it. The STRs, you're measuring the leaves out here. The SNPs measure the branches down here to the twigs. And realistically, at the moment, as I stand here and talk to you, there's a bit of a gap between how far you can get with these single base changes on the Y-chromosome down to the leaves. And that's really where we are, and to some extent where the action is going to be over the future. But it's always very useful in this DNA area when you're trying to remember what SNPs and STRs measure. Think of the tree, think of the leaves for doing family history, and think of the branches and the twigs as the deep ancestry stuff that we have. So with STR testing, as Maurice said, I first stumbled into this in about the year 2000, but really picked it up properly in about 2006. And so there's been a gradual increase in the number of markers that have been used for STR testing. Starting in there, 12, then to 25, then to 37, then to 67, then to 111. So when I first started, we were down here in about the 37 marker range. When I first encountered it, in fact, it was right back at this level. So I've seen it change that far in this area over time. And that, again, is really to provide people with more discrimination as we've learned more as the field has gone along. I would say that the markers that the testing companies use, particularly our friends from Family Tree DNA over there, because they have the largest number of markers that you can look at, they have different mutation rates. And they use a combination of slow and fast mutating markers. If everything was slow, you wouldn't get any discrimination at all, and it would be a lot more difficult for use for doing family history. So it's a balance between slow and fast markers. It's just you'll hear people talking about markers, and they are not all the same. And it's a balancing act between having a combination of slow and fast markers. And this is just my attempt just to show some of these visuals. You don't need to worry about it, but quite often with markers you can get a very high percentage of people just having one value on that markers, and very small amounts, if you like, outside that range. So this is one particular number, and you get people that have a combination a bit upstream and a bit downstream. The bulk of people will be here. But you can get other markers, and same here, you know, bulk of people in one, very small numbers outside. But you get other markers that have quite a wide variation, if you like, over a series of about 5 to 6 numbers that are in there. There's always a top and bottom limit for the numbers that are around. Sorry. Back. And I am going to plug a couple of things for people that are here. If you want to learn about this, we have a lady here, Debbie Kennett, has 2 very nice books. DNAs and Social Networking is a book that's around, and a similar book on the Surnames handbook. People often ask us, where's the best place to go and look at books on DNA? That's what I recommend at the moment to get it. In this case, the DNA bit, but there's this bit again to get at surnames. And I am going to say 3 or 4 slides about ISOG. That's why I'm here, if you like, over this time. So I said ISOG was set up in 2005. They have a thing there called the ISOG Wiki. It has a nice front page, comparison charts for DNA testing companies, lots of historical lines. So if you want one-stop shopping to learn more about DNA when I've finished, I'm going to say ISOG. This is what its website looks like. Again, welcome page. Comparison charts of DNA testing companies. If you want to do that, that's what I get asked all the time. I am going to recommend the one over there based on my personal experience, but we have to be fair, and there is comparison charts with the other companies over there. You do need to look at that, because it's not always possible to transfer results from one company across into another one when you're getting at that. Okay. The other thing that ISOG does is what's called a haplotree. That's these deep ancestry SNPs. That's, again, is on the ISOG wiki, ISOG website, a haplotree website. This is the naming to look at those deep ancestry SNPs. I have to say, this is one of the more complicated areas you get into when you get into DNA, but it is important. The reason why it's complicated is there's no standardized way to name these. So they're named and numbered as groups discover them. So at the moment there's an explosion of interest in looking at that. And this is one of the major ways that people use to keep track as to what's going on. And there's a phenomenal amount of effort that goes into doing that to keep it up to date. Okay, back to conventional family history. Have all of you seen this in your time? DNA Surname Atlas? Any show of hands? Most people have seen it. If you want to look at where surnames are located, essential to use to get at that, to find the homes of British surnames as to where you go. The other thing, of course, I get asked all the time with DNA testing is, what does it cost? Is it expensive? Okay? And the answer I give to that is yes and no. I always say you can begin at $49 to 12 markers. Okay, that's what we have over there. So anyone can afford to get started on the Y-chromosome at $49 to 12 markers. And you can upgrade in stages, join a surname project, 37 markers has to be the goal these days. So you can start at $49 to 12. 37 markers has to be the goal though, because that's, when you're getting into the number of people in the database, you're looking for matches now, you need to get up in a number that's manageable. And 12 markers will give you far too many hits. 37 markers, again, depending on your surname, you may get too many hits. But we have to start somewhere. Pick 2 male, ideally plan to test 2 male descendants whose lines meet about 200 years ago as a starting target, and you should consider funding that. Obviously, I'd rather have you in there just to begin with no, but think at the end of the day, you've got to get somewhere to having 2 male descendants whose lines meet 200 years ago, if you're going to progress. We'll talk about that a bit more as we work our way through. You can add speculative cousins to the initial database, check for matches in the database. In my experience, again, if you get positive results, they're an incentive to recruit other people. And I do have to say, sooner or later, if you do DNA, you're likely to come across non-paternity events, NPEs, if you do this, if you get a big enough database. There was a talk, certainly here, by a gentleman called Jeff Swinfield, who's well known in family history circles, and his talk is how DNA screwed up my family tree, and discovered it wasn't a family tree. On the other hand, I do say to people, if that does give you a concern, don't equally do family history. You have no idea when you're going to turn up people that are illegitimate on your family tree, so it really is not that much different from that. So if you don't want to discover the unexpected, don't do family history, full stop, because it's elements really of the same thing. So I found, again, selective recruitment is an absolutely key element of strategy. But I would say the second one, because if you hear people speaking here, this all sounds wonderful, but in my practical experience, I would say never underestimate the amount of time both to construct the family trees and selectively recruit the people to DNA test. It all sounds wonderful when we stand up here and talk about it, but in my practical experience, this is really important to bear in mind. More so, as I will say, with in some ways with the British. You have to adjust the conversation to people depending on the response that you receive if you're trying to recruit people. You have to take it at whatever pace and response you get back from the conversation that you're having. It is an integral part of doing the project to get people DNA tests. And for larger surname projects, it is almost impractical to research all the family trees involved. I have to say that because I'm talking about Welsh family history. People who do DNA testing somehow have a wonderful idea that out there's going to be someone who's done all the research on all the trees, and all they got to do is plug it in. And of course, it ain't like that. If you have big surname projects, realistically, the people that run it are almost full-time in sorting the people on the basis of the DNA data. And there's going to be a fair amount of onus on you to sort through your matches and speak to them, to pool your efforts to look at the family history. The people that actually administer the projects, for some of the bigger ones, it's impractical for them to do that. So a few more thoughts really about selective recruitment. I said, how would you get the British to take a DNA test? And it's, essentially, there's only, in my opinion, there's only two ways to do it: active versus passive. Getting the British to test is quite hard work. Getting them to realise they need to recruit people they do not know personally and persuade them to get involved is even harder. You know, that is my experience. But no one at the end of the day is going to do it for you. That's what you have to some extent, get involved in doing it. I'd love to have you and your data in the DNA project. But for it to move forward, it really is ultimately a choice between active versus passive as to how you run these things, to move it forward in a reasonable time. And as I said, sooner or later you're going to have to speak to someone you do not know with the aim of cold call recruiting them, both from the British side, and I have to say also from my colleagues in America, because so much stuff is going online now. In principle, there's no reason why they can't start assembling the trees of the people and the families that are interested over here in Britain. It's like everything else, it's a matter of time. And in my experience, again, it helps if you generate some databases or some other information to offer people something. As any of us who do family history these days, you can get back to 1837, 1841 relatively quickly, even in Wales, with some luck, doing things that took me in the good old days, you know, years to do. If you're lucky, you can do them overnight. Even with some of the more common names, you know, with some of the companies, you can manage to do that without too much trouble. But it does help if you have something to offer people when you're starting to speak to them about DNA. I've said this before, 37 markers regarded as standard, usually sufficient for same surname studies in the past 200 to 300 years, not so effective in defining branches further back in time. And essentially the more markers the better, and faster mutating markers help when you get back before 200, 300 years in terms of doing that. So that relates to upgrades. And again, my experience and experience of a number of people now, the upgrades from 38 to 67 markers, they're slow mutating. So they're good for filling up borderline matches at 37 markers. If you get what correlations of 33 markers or 34 markers matching at 37, that's what we would call borderline. You know, if you're up at 36, 37, then you feel a lot more confident they're in the same family if they have the same surname. If you get this, then you always get it with DNA. There's some answers which are really nice positive, there's some which are clearly negative, and almost their definition, there's some in the middle where you're not quite certain. And the answer to those ones that are not certain is almost invariably to do more DNA testing, not to spend all your time poring over and looking at what you've got to see if you can make any more sense of it, because in general you can't. The answer is, did you always upgrade? So I've had a number of cases that I've worked on, not just on families from Wales, where these have either held up or fallen apart if I've done upgrades to that. So I said, and again, it's essential if you see large number of matches at 37 markers, which you can do. The upgrades from 68 to 111 can be better at defining branches because of those faster mutating markers. You're looking for markers really that enable you to discriminate between descent branches of families once you've got the initial match. And the concept that people talk about this is triangulation. And basically, you're down here with a bunch of markers which can vary. These numbers can vary, and what you're trying to do is go back up the tree to compare to people back up here and find a common ancestor. And the way you do that is by basically taking the people down here and finding the bits that match. I said if you can occasionally get numbers that look like this, which is a non-paternity event, which do not match the other people on their tree. And I certainly have had a couple of people in my experience that fall into that. Okay, briefly, where did I get involved in this? This is my middle name, Sir Thomas Picton, who is Welsh, hence my interest in Welsh ancestry. He's called Wellington's Welsh General. He served through all these things. He was killed at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, so we're coming up to his bicentenary that's here. He's reburied in St Paul's Cathedral. Nominally the only Welshman buried in St Paul's Cathedral. I'd love to pretend he got in there because of being killed at the Battle of Waterloo, but in fact they were clearing the cemeteries at St George's, Hanover Square, as they cleared all the graveyards in London in the 1850s. And so they just wrote to the letters to the Home Secretary and so on, saying, isn't it a shame he's languishing, forgotten in the catacombs of St George's, Hanover Square. And they got agreement to get him reburied in St Paul's Cathedral. So if you go there, you can see him to today. That's a story I got handed down from in my family. My father died when I was 10, so I didn't really have that much to go on. And in some ways, it's taken me, since I heard that when I was about 19, till about probably 12 months ago, to decide I can actually answer, how am I related to him? So it's been about a 45-year journey for me, and DNA is an absolutely integral part for that to happen. That's just really what I've said. It's the memorial to him at St Paul's Cathedral, the only Welshman there, and that's really how he got in there. That's a memorial to him erected down in Carmarthen, this nice obelisk which looks a bit like Cleopatra's Needle. It's actually fallen down once, and a gentleman campaigned and managed to get it rebuilt, otherwise it wouldn't be there. It cost a fair amount of money to get it repointed and reset up again. But you can go down and see that in the centre of Carmarthen. And this is the sort of maps you get from looking at that census thing that I showed you, the 1881 census. So if you type Picton into there, you can see it lights up all this area down here in Pembrokeshire, in Carmarthen. It's 1881, so you're out into the industrial valleys of South Wales. This also happens to be my family up here in Anglesey. But you can see there are other bits of the surname sitting over here in Cheshire and in Lancashire, a big clump of them sitting down here in London, bits down here in Hampshire, bits down there in Kent. And it's one of the reasons I took a very long time to join the Guild of One Name Studies, because I saw, from this, okay, I'm interested in these lot down here, but I know from paper research I've done, this lot up here are not related to the ones down in Wales, And I thought, well, you have to really be interested in your surname just coming from one origin to join the Guild of One Name Studies. It's not quite like that. You can be just interested in the surname, and as long as you answer people who ask you and say, no, I haven't done research on your lot that are down here, but I'm aware of them and I've got them in my database, you can get away with that. And just to give you some idea, you may think that's an uncommon name, Picton, but there are about 6,500 births, 3,500 marriages over 1837 to 2005 in England and Wales, and the surname's rare in Scotland and Ireland, and they're all in the 20th century when you got there, so it's an England and Wales name that we're dealing with. But this is, probably higher than I think most people would imagine if you're looking at that. And I collect these in spreadsheets, and roughly about 37% of the families have origins which can be traced back to Wales, from over this period of time. And I said other families that are in Lancashire, Cheshire, Buckinghamshire, London, Yorkshire. But from doing all of that and clustering, I've managed to find that all families in Wales could be traced back to 9 family groups living in Pembrokeshire around 1800 to 1820. Again, that's very easy to say. It takes you quite a lot of time to do the work. So I knew I had 9 family groups, and realistically it's taken me from 2006 to 2013 to recruit one representative of all those family groups. I got about half of that really quite quickly in the first year or two, and then getting the last ones has been a lot of hard work to do that, through a combination of reasons really. You do need to be gently persistent with some of these and chase and hound people gently to get them to come back. It is one of the lessons you learn with DNA. And I have to say, I've spent an inordinate amount of time trying to recruit male descendants from Sir Thomas Picton's line. It's obviously the first thing I did in his family history. That's moderately easy to research in terms of wills and stuff. I've even gotten into looking at 4 illegitimate children that he had by his mistress when he was governor of Trinidad out in the West Indies, which of course I thought again would be a pipe dream to ever get there to do it. But my dear gentleman here, Morris, has actually gone to Trinidad on occasion and got me contact names. I found out, believe it or not, again, through the internet, there was a guy that had gone from Australia into the archives at Trinidad because Creole women were of interest to him. You know, they were totally different from women in English society in the sort of 1760s to 1820s. And he got interested in Sir Thomas Picton because he had a mistress out there and her role essentially out in Trinidad. I never managed to get there when I was working. But it just goes to show, as always, with the internet, where you can go these days to get things. So I always thought this was going to be a pipe dream, but he actually managed to get at some of that, and I'm saying, no, sorry, it looks as though it sort of dies out in about the 1840s. So I really have tried almost everything to look at paper on that. However, as we will see, DNA has come up trumps. So this is the sort of map that you can do, looking at those 9 clumps. By way of a paper trail, the earliest people you can trace on paper go back to this lot up in North Pembrokeshire. They clumped around these parishes, Nevern, Newport, whatever. Then all Sir Thomas Picton's family himself basically goes back to this parish in Rudbaxton and then down to this parish in Martlethwaite. And all the other families in clumps come from other parishes on the Pembrokeshire border, ranging from this lot on the Pembrokeshire Carmarthen border through places here, Carew, Martlethwaite, Langholm, Haverford West, which is here, out further west, Harrelston West, and out to people at Marlows and Dale in terms of the 9 clumps that I'm dealing with. And you don't really need to look at the detail on this. This is just to say that of the lot that I can get back furthest, which is on to about 1584 and ultimately back to about 1434 or beyond, they go through this gentleman here, Owen Picton of Nevern. So he's at the top, but I do want you to focus on this gentleman here, because he essentially is the gateway ancestor to all the people in that northern branch that survive. There's one branch that goes down here, and they all went off to the USA and go down here, so they're descendants in the USA. And there's another branch which comes down here through a younger brother, Thomas, to a whole bunch of people I pick out here in yellow, A, B, C, D, E, F. Those are the other clumps. So it's just to show again, you have people that emigrate to America, you have people that stay behind at home. I have found, again, through my practical experience, it tends to be easier to recruit people that have gone to America. And again, you have the technology now to get at the people that are in America in terms of researching them. So that's been pretty useful for me in terms of recruiting people. The other thing you find is quite a number of branches. I'm going to pick one here. Comes down to 3 people. That dies out in 1852. Okay, and the more of these family history groupings that you look at, you tend to find the fate of most male lines is to die out or to daughter out. There's a fairly small number that actually make it down a lot of generations to the present time. Now I've got another one here, you know, this all looks good. You've got a guy here in 1780, and lo and behold, down here in 1957, you've got all of this lot dying out down here, you know. When you're trying to find these matches, it is a little bit frustrating. So this is where we went really to look at that group we can get back furthest. Essentially, I managed to recruit 3 people down different branches from this guy in 1713. So while I'm saying at the top, I go back a long way. In fact, I'm triangulating, if I use that word triangulating, on this guy from 1713. So although I've got a date further up back here, I'm really, my DNA results are only relating to this person here. So the phenomenon that's used by population geneticists is called pedigree collapse. You're actually losing a whole number of people through different branches, and then your small ones remain. As I said, the fate of most male lines is actually to die out and daughter out. And I'm going to say this, slowly but surely, the family history community is learning some of the language of population geneticists. If you hear the people that talk about deep ancestry, this is a well-recognized term. It's just that we are discovering it ourselves in family history terms through our own practical experience of looking at this. But I am talking about Wales. And one of the things that the Wales have, which I'll say on some more, is it has quite a long oral history, which England doesn't really have any equivalent to, but Ireland does. in terms of pedigree books and things that get preserved. And this is just me showing a couple of examples from my practical experience here. This is Philip Picton, that's him up there, Philip Picton. And from other documents, believe it or not, I can have around, he would have lived around about this time period, 1240 to 1280. There are no dates on this pedigree, but from other documents, particularly estate records, I can date this. This gentleman here, Jenkin Picton, lived about 1434. Again, through estate records, I can connect Jenkin Picton to Howell Picton here, who died by 1512. And you go all the way down here to this gentleman at the bottom, Thomas Picton, of a guy called Trelifant, who died in 1655. This is just one page. If you go over the top, this pedigree actually goes down to about 1700. Okay, so these pedigree books do survive in certain places for Wales. And the Pictons, right at the top here, you can see Advenai Pembroke. And these pedigree books in this particular case were labelled Advenai, which is a Latin word for foreigners. So they were non-native Welsh people. So probably, I'm going to call them Normanno-British in origin, or possibly a surname. When these pedigrees get put together by the heralds, they recognise these were essentially families that migrated into Wales. And as far as I know, these sorts of groups of surnames have never been properly or fully captured anywhere. So I'm bringing it to your attention that there is this information buried in pedigree books. I am going to say just quickly, because this is a combination of DNA and family history in Wales, the guy who did a phenomenal amount of work on this is a guy called Peter Bartram. He died fairly recently, about 5 years ago, aged 100. And he spent about 45 years collecting all of the ancient pedigree books that existed for Wales. But he essentially stopped at 1500. He had 6 volumes, which covers from the beginning to 1400. Believe it or not, another 18 volumes, which covered 1400 to 1500, and he cut off at that stage. So this is his version of what I showed you on the previous page, okay? But it cuts it all off at 1500. And what I showed you on the previous page is that pedigree book actually goes down to 1700. But he has a cut off there from that. So there is quite a lot of information buried in these pedigree books, but of course it ain't online, okay? And we're in the $64,000 loop. Who's going to image them? Who's going to have the cost? Whatever, okay? But it is like Ireland. Wales has these pedigree books that sit there. No one is ever going to go back and do what Peter Bartram did, I don't think, in terms of the manuscripts. We did it today, of course. We'd have the digital images, we'd have a side-by-side comparison. But Wales does have this unique history element, which is common to Ireland, which Britain doesn't have. It's a strong oral tradition. Okay, I'm just going to tell you another bit of story. That's a little bit of my paper history. This is back to the STRs that I'm talking about. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you time to talk through all the details here. But haplogroup R1b is the most common haplogroup in the British Isles. It's probably about 70% of the population. And you divide this with further SNPs down into major groups. And one of the major groups is U106 as a subgroup from that. And the only point of me showing this again is to how complicated all of that is getting now with branches coming off it. It's really a family tree of these single base changes. And down somewhere about here is actually our R Picton group. And when I got into looking at this deep ancestry, I kept matching a gentleman here called Craig Venter across these markers here. I happen to have a Picton guinea pig. I'm not a Picton, but I have a Picton guinea pig in the States who's willing to take almost any DNA test that I ask him to do. And Craig Venter is probably lost on most of you in this audience. But in 2001, with Bill Clinton and another gentleman called Francis Collins, he's the guy who gets the claim for sequencing the original human genome in the White House. So when I came across that, I was just amazed. And of course, it so happened, even though his Y-chromosome is in the public domain nominally, it's not actually analysed to the standard that we would use today to do the comparisons on those STRs that we looked at. And of course, what you don't do is send an email to Professor Venter and say, please can I have a sample of your DNA. Your email has got about a half-life of 3 seconds, even if it ever gets anywhere, because he's that busy. So you need something special to recruit him, and essentially I managed to sort out where his gateway ancestor went to America. And with that, I actually managed to get his DNA sample. And that really is the story behind this slide. Professor Craig Venter, this is him in the Wall Street Journal for 2010, you know, multi-millionaire. And essentially, I said our deep ancestry matched him, and we matched him at these values across those STR markers that I was talking about. Our patrons, I showed you, came from Pembrokeshire, and Craig Venter's family, as far as we can trace it back at the moment, comes from Lincolnshire. And the only reason I tell you that story is that people have a wonderful habit of taking your SNP data that we get at the moment in terms of deep ancestry and sticking it on maps and saying, you know, I wonder if there's a correlation. So this is my reality check when people are talking about there, from my practical experience, as to what it tells you at the moment, okay? Again, this is what we do. This is my flash through doing Welsh ancestry. Just to remind you, the people really that have written all the books, to be fair, on Welsh ancestry, John and Sheila Rowlands. For those who are here 2 days ago, John Rowlands was talking about the book, about this new book on the next slide. So this is Welsh family history, second stages of researching Welsh family history. A little bit blurred, I'm afraid. It's off the internet. And the Surnames of Wales, which literally has just been published, 2014. All I can say is me diving around in Wales when I wasn't working. They have an absolute lifetime of experience in doing Wales family history. I'm not going to run through that. That's just the title page of everything that's covered in this 2000 book on the surnames in Wales. But what I am going to say is the records online for Wales is probably the best area of the British Isles at the moment for records online. They've got the censuses online, parish registers for all of Wales are Find My Pass. Trouble with Wales is parish registers before 1750, as anyone does it, is the exception rather than the rule. It's out there, it's peripheral, if you like, to London and so on. It's one of the frustrations of doing Welsh family history. And the bishop's transcripts, which you can use again at 1799, they're not online, they're at Aberystwyth. What they've got is a huge amount of all the wills and administration from the 16th century to 1858 at the National Library of Wales website. So we are really lucky compared to other people in Britain. A huge amount now of Welsh newspapers going online. There's a bit just around the corner looking at that. But again, you have to say for Wales, the chapel records are very important from the, well, really going back as far as the 17th, but particularly the 18th and 19th centuries. And they can be held at various locations. Some of them are online, but you do need to get, to some extent for Wales, in tracing the family histories of your chapels, because that determines where they went. The ministers travelled around a lot. And I'm just citing a practical example at the moment with a particular chapel at a place called Whitechurch. But all the baptisms, all the early ones, until after 1800, are recorded at a chapel that's 10 miles away. You're riding around 2/3 of the Preseli Hills to get there. Goodness knows how the pastor did it, but it's a fact of life. You have this family history of the chapels, and you need to sort of sort that through in terms of finding your way around Wales. Important again to say what is not online, because of course we all get the impression that everything is online, and of course it ain't. Very important thing that the tithe maps and the surnames that go with tithe maps are immensely detailed in looking at maps of particular parishes that you get into, and they have apportionments, a list of names. It tells you who owned and occupied every field. And it's usually possible to work out where your ancestors lived down to the house level, combining with the 1841 and 1851 census. The records will tell you who owned the land. And certainly for Wales, and probably for anywhere outside London, anywhere that's rural, you need to get into who owned the land that your ancestors are on, and that's the way to do it. Further back from that, the land text records are valuable. For Pembrokeshire, they go back to 1786. Bad news is that the Carmarthen, they don't survive. I don't have that for the whole of Wales, but you can find that information. Many estate records and collections are still not that well indexed for personal names and details of their contents. Some says not much more than there's 24 boxes with material from these parishes, which is frustrating for us doing that. And there's again a huge amount of documenting in Wales, what's known as the Court of the Great Sessions and the Acts of Union, which are extensive as the Chancery and Exchequer proceedings in England. For those of you who do family history and get into the legal side of things, there's a massive stuff at the National Archives on these things, most of which are not online. Okay. I'm going to say, if you're interested in surnames in Wales, there are two main Wales DNA surname projects running at Family Tree DNA.
Thank you for visiting Recruitment to our live 2014.
Just going to wait a minute. Okay.
With any remaining visitors, please make your way to the exit at the front of the hall.
Okay.
Hope you enjoyed your day.
There's a Wales Cymru DNA project, 602 members. You must have already traced your DNA line back to the country of Wales in order to join this project. Membership requires submitting ancestral information and administration approval. Okay, so that's to get the people that definitely have surnames that definitely came from Wales. There's another group, it's called the Welsh Patronymics Group, 608 members, designed to establish links between various families of Welsh origin with patronymic style surnames. Go on to the FTDNA website, look at these two projects. They have the list of surnames in there that are the members. It gives you some idea of the surnames that are in there in those two projects in terms of the Welsh surnames. That has to be one of the places where you go to look at in terms of that. And so if you are from Wales and can get your family history back a short way, they would love to have you in those groups. I'm going to skip that one. I've said bits of this before. Wales have a long and extensive bardic history, and it's an important part of the legal system until the Acts of Union. This particular guy, David Edwards, who was the Deputy Herald for Wales, was responsible for sorting out some of the complexities there and grouping them into family groups to do that. As I said, Wales serves as a halfway house in this area between England and Ireland. Peter Bartram's work that I talked about before, you can access at this website in there, and that's the 6 and 18 volumes that I talked about. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures from the Rowlands books that came out there, just to give you some idea that it's not all totally helpless with surnames in Wales.
Thank you for visiting Recruitment to our live 2014. The show is now closed.
Okay, this is the
With
same.
any remaining visitors, please make your way to the exit at the front of the hall. We hope you enjoyed your day.
Sounds like a British Rail announcement, isn't it? You're trying to work your way over this thing. Okay.
The power to stand will terminate in 30 minutes at 6 p.m.
Okay. This just shows the map that they have in there of the 10 most common surnames in Wales, colour-coded here. In terms of the distribution, this is by hundreds in Wales. So some of them, as you can see, you really do have, parishes made up with a huge percentage of these very common surnames. But there are other bits of Wales where these are not quite as common as you might think. So it does depend, as the advert says, on location, where your ancestors did come from Wales. It is again, more heterogeneous than you might think. And you just need to contrast this list of names up here with the 10 most common surnames of English origins, which are the ones down here. So it's a very different surname distribution. And the other thing I want to say, which is unique to Wales, it has this patronymic surnames, a whole string of Christian names, as it looks like, which is them remembering their ancestry that's in there. That is important. And I've never seen this before. What John and Sheila Rowlands have looked at is a decay of patronymic naming in Wales down to the 10% level in their book. And as you can see, down here in West Wales, Pembrokeshire, which I happen to be interested in, patronymics disappeared relatively early. And again, they have quite a wide range of other surnames down here in Wales. Same with the border areas here to the English counties, south part of Glamorgan. But you have two heartlands, this part in North Cardinghamshire, and this part up here in Merionethshire, Carmarthen, which persisted to a really late date, to 1850, in some cases from there. But that's certainly the first time I've ever seen a patronymic surname distribution map for Wales. And what struck me when I say it, I'm just going to throw it out, is if you start looking back in the history of Wales, what are called martial lordships, they're the ways that they control Wales before the Acts of Union. You get the colour.
With any remaining visitors, please make your way to the exit at the front of the hall.
You get the same sort of colour distribution.
Exhibitors are reminded that power to stand will terminate at 6 o'clock.
you get the same sort of distribution of the Marcher lordships owning this, and these are the heartlands of Wales, you know, from 1234. And the same thing, this is Llewellyn ap Griffith, the territories that he had and the territory he gained. So there is a seeming overlap between that bit of history, if you like, and the patronymic distribution of the surnames that we have in Wales. Okay, they're obviously going to be against us with timing on this. Yeah, I hear you saying, so that's fine. So I'm going to skip through some of these ones. I apologise, we're going to be out of time. I just want to show you a couple of things at the end. I am going to talk a little bit about this on the SNPs. This is next generation sequencing that we have. This is really where we are on those SNPs at the moment. I mentioned there's about a 2,500 year gap between them. And we're just starting to get in to try and close that by essentially looking at what's called next generation sequencing. It's been really difficult to sequence the Y-chromosome for reasons that I won't have time to go into today. But there are at least 2 companies now starting to offer this. Quite expensive, $1,250, but they're talking about sequencing somewhere in the order of 17 million parts of the Y DNA there. Family Tree DNA are talking about sequencing probably 10 million in the order of $600. And that's likely to transform all of those analyses of the SNPs that you have. And if you remember, SNPs will always trump the STRs that you have. So in potential, it offers you the ability to get right down those twigs and out to the leaves. And the only that really says where that is. I'll leave that on the screen, but I won't talk through it. I just want to leave you with the final slide, and that's to say that buying a DNA test is like buying a computer. If you wait for it to stabilise or come down in price, you will never buy one. Make sure you get at least one male relative tested, especially if it's getting on a bit and you don't know where the next one is located. I always used to say the 3 things you need to do in family history: write on the photographs, take pictures of the tombstones, run the photographs, take pictures of the tombstones. But what you need to do now, of course, is make certain you get the last male, you have their DNA tested, because the game changes and moves on. And the number of times I've had that conversation out there through ISOG, my father died 3 years ago, what do I do? And the answer is, of course, it's hard work. You've got to go back, upwards and sideways. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brian. Well, we've run out of time, so I'm afraid there's not going to be any time for questions, but I can thank you all for your attendance here today at the DNA workshop. It's been a really great success, and I hope you got something out of it. Most of the presentations will be on YouTube. Go and search for DNA Lectures, Who Do You Think You Are 2014, and you'll find the majority of the lectures up on YouTube. So if you've missed anything that you wish you'd seen, go to YouTube, they'll be up there in the next week or so. DNA Lectures, Who Do You Think You Are 2014. Thank you very much. Have a safe journey home.
Sorry about Perfect. All right, guys. See what it does. Oh, yeah.